Nick, are you ready to start?
I am.
Okay. Next presenter will be Nick Fry, who's the archivist at the National Railroad Museum Library, the National Railroad Library at the University of Missouri. Wrong there, but Beringer. And he's also the archivist for the B&O Railroad Historical Society. He has given numerous presentations at many cons and conventions, and he's working on the book on the B&O St. Louis division. So, Nick, you can start with your presentation on the Ohio and Mississippi.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Andy, for the introduction. Thanks, everybody, for joining us virtually today. This is going to be a presentation on the Ohio and Mississippi. So we're not going to see a lot of B&O content as the B&O, and we're actually not going to see a lot of content as the B&O's Southwestern. This is going to focus mainly on the O&M and how it connected Cincinnati and St. Louis. But it's not how you might expect the connection worked out at first. Before we really get deeply into this, I need to thank Ed Young, who has, he passed away a few years ago. Ed started the St. Louis Division Book Project, and Ed was also the coordinator with Andy for our convention in Seymour, Indiana, where if you were able to attend it, you got a goodly amount of O&M background information on the St. Louis division. And we wouldn't be here without Ed's work. And if you've been at the archives and seen the material that Ed had collected for this, it's going to be quite a project when it's done. And we still have a ways to go. So that was gosh, that was almost 13 years ago, I think now. So this is Ed at Seymour, and this was the beginning of what would have been this project. So why were you going to build a railroad connecting St. Louis and Cincinnati? Basically, it goes to the outcome of the Mexican War. The Louisiana Purchase expanded the United States territories north and west to the Pacific Ocean. What was Oregon Territory makes it the states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, and parts of Montana. That was the original Pacific outlet. And the Mexican War expanded our territory down through the California coast and secured Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Nevada. So this expansion set up a lot of a land rush attitude in the United States. The Mexican territories, they had found gold at Sutter's Fort in 1848. When this had been under the dominion of Spain, the tales of the riches of the Southwest were pretty well known. And the city of St. Louis here had already been doing a pretty good business with traders coming from both the Northwest with fur trade and trade coming in from the Southwest. Along the river systems, the Arkansas River, parts of the Missouri River would connect to trails at what is now Kansas City and Independence and St. Joseph. St. Louis was a bustling community because of this, and it was a highly desirable terminal for a railroad at this time. And if you add on now this vast untapped potential for economic growth, it creates an even greater impetus to build a railroad connecting that city and the East Coast. This is in the both of these images. This is Cincinnati. This is the eastern line of the railroad, and Cincinnati was east of St. Louis, the furthest west major river port on the Ohio River. It was a bustling and booming community in the 1840s. You were seeing the growth of manufacturing, shipyards, and it was becoming a terminal point for projects that were going to link the Great Lakes trades to the Ohio River. The Erie Canal had opened up the Great Lakes, and commerce was expanding there. The communities on the Ohio River system were concerned about getting left behind, but also with the expansion into the Southwestern Territories, you need an easy way to move goods and people between the Erie Canal system and the Ohio River. Pittsburgh was a big center to try and capture this traffic. And there was a lot of interstate rivalry for this kind of trade. So Pennsylvania is seeing the Pennsylvania State Works project. They're looking at building canals linking Pittsburgh and the Erie Canal, either at Erie or other points. And Ohio is looking at this and saying, we can't get left behind. So cities like Cincinnati are being championed as potential terminal points for trade with these existing routes. So for the O&M, it's kind of a no-brainer. There's railroad projects that are going into that area. There's canal projects. Cincinnati is a logical easternmost point because you're probably going to see railroads connect at Cincinnati and you won't have to build past Cincinnati. And just here's an example as to what's happening in the United States in general. This is one of the great maps. This was done for a historical atlas that the US government published. This is rates of travel in 1800 compared with 1830. So this is about 18 years before the Mexican War. Railroad traffic and construction has already expanded and cut down these numbers already. But, you know, here's St. Louis. And that's about a 5-week trip from New York. And that's in 1800. So Lewis and Clark, from the time they leave Harper's Ferry or Cumberland on the National Road area, Harper's Ferry is one of their last supply points. So it's about a 4-week trip to get to St. Louis from the Harper's Ferry Arsenal and then go west. By 1830, that time has already been reduced by about 80%. And that number gets better into the 1840s. So you're seeing just explosive growth. And this isn't lost on either St. Louis, Indianapolis, Columbus, Ohio, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Louisville. One of the first big projects to connect the Midwest, or what was then called the Old Northwest, with the East Coast would have been the National Road. It never really got all the way to Illinois Town, which was the original name for East St. Louis. It stopped in Vandalia, Illinois. If you drive US 40 today, you're going to mimic the routing for the most part of the National Road. It's been straightened out some, but that's as close as you're going to get for the majority of your trip. In some cases, it's a state road. Some cases, it's an alternate US route. But the National Road was the first big project to bridge these two regions and help stimulate trade. You'll notice it really doesn't follow any watercourse of significance. Once it passes St. Clairsville and Wheeling, you're really out of the range of the Ohio River. And as river traffic is growing, the road is still there. It's still a functioning and competitive route because The rivers are not managed like they are today with the Army Corps of Engineers. You have rapids, you have rivers freezing, so the road's still competitive. The new technology that's coming in when the railroad's being built, here, of course, is the steam locomotive. And if you look at the major eastern lines that were being built, they were all trying to connect trade with the East Coast ports with the Midwest. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, they are all competing with one another. The southern railroads, not as much. That really won't happen until Charleston starts thinking about connecting with Cincinnati. They're thinking about it, but they don't really have the support to do these projects at a state level yet. New York had built the Erie Canal. Pennsylvania had built the Pennsylvania State Works. Maryland was heavily financing the B&O. And the US government had funded the National Road. So these were all state-funded projects to connect these commercial centers. And there's a lot of boosterism going on within these trading communities. And if you're not on the National Road, you're going to try and figure out how you can get on one of these systems. Either you're going to be on a canal or a railroad. And if you're a forward-thinking community in the 1830s and 1840s, you're looking at the railroad long-term as the best way to go. One other thing you're interested in, as the population is expanding, you're going to want to look at the mail routes. That's a guaranteed source of income for whatever project you fund. If you can get the mail contract from the US government, that's pretty much a guaranteed source of traffic that's going to provide your company with a good source of income. And if you look at some of the railroad routings, you know, these mail routes and the railroads match up. One of the great ones here, the Overland Mail in the 1850s out of Independence. The line out of St. Louis, that is very close to the Pacific Railroad of Missouri. So these mail routes are also highly sought after, and they're going to drive some of the investment in railroads. You're going to connect the two ends of a US mail route if you can, because then you're going to capture that traffic from the stagecoaches. So with all of that going on, you would think, well, the O&M becomes the B&O. And at first glance, you think, okay, well, let's look at the board of directors. They all seem to be Midwesterners, and it's a locally designed project and locally financed. That's not the case. There's a couple things to look at here. And to quote Hal Holbrook's character from All the President's Men, you have to follow the money. For the O&M, a lot of the money is coming out of New York. Now, there's a good chunk of money coming from the state-funded bonds, from the local municipal and county bonds. But if you're going to build a railroad, you're going to have to find a huge amount of capital. And you're either going to find that in Europe or you're going to find that in New York. And in this case, it's the Erie Railroad interests who come in and start looking at stealing a march on the other eastern railroads in the early 1850s and connect New York City with St. Louis. The first step with the Erie is they have to build the what it became the Atlantic and Great Western Railroad. The original concept was a railroad from Buffalo to Columbus to Cincinnati and then to St. Louis. And what they wind up having to do is build it in parts. And the first part they're going to look at is what becomes the Atlantic and Great Western. So they're going to connect Buffalo with Cincinnati. And if you were at the convention in Dayton, you remember we went and saw the Hamilton, Ohio, where the Erie had rights to go into Cincinnati. That original goal to get to Cincinnati goes back to the 1850s with the Atlantic and Great Western. And to provide an even bigger smoking gun, this is the Atlantic and Great Western's routing. This is from a site where they had this for sale. Straight off. A railroad, if you look at railroad maps, the friendly connections are always in bold, and the unfriendly or neutral connections are done almost to the point where you can't see them, because the map is an advertising tool. It's there to get the customer or the passenger to realize, oh, well, this is how my goods are going to get here, or this is how I should go, because I can't, there's no obvious other way to get from here to there. The Atlantic and Great Western promoting the Erie, the AG&W itself is much bolder. That has a much darker and wider line. And then the Ohio and Mississippi. Another factor that tells you that there's some connection here, all of these railroads are broad gauge. They're all using Erie gauge. You don't tend to do that if you're going to interchange with a railroad that has a different gauge. Operationally, that is a huge headache. So if you're going to connect that way, you build your railroad so that it plays nicely with your preferred connection. In this case, it is the Erie. The goal is New York via the Erie, which also, leads to possibly one of the best railroad jokes I've ever heard. You can use this with many different railroads. I want to get somewhere in the worst way. And generally, if you were going from New York to anywhere, you chose the Erie as the punchline. Now, the big problem with building the Ohio and Mississippi, and it's a problem that generally had not been dealt with before, was this was a railroad that was going to span 3 states. And in the 1840s, that meant you had to get charters to set up the company and operate in those states. So the boosters of the Ohio and Mississippi, having gotten friendly noises from New York, having decided that we need to do this to help maintain our civic competitiveness against other railroad projects that are coming online, particularly in Illinois, they decide we're going to go ahead and get our charters. Indiana stepped up right away. February 14th, 1848, they are like, all right, yeah, do it. Let's build this railroad. Their big concern is making sure that Indiana is not going to be left behind in any commercial development. They're already dealing with the fact that they've got this giant city, Cincinnati, on their eastern border. And then further west, they've got St. Louis. And they're trying to make sure that southern Indiana is not left behind. Northern Indiana, you're seeing this community that was built around Fort Dearborn called Chicago is exploding. And that's looking to siphon off a lot of the commercial development that was going on in northern Indiana. So Indiana is very pro-railroad at this time. They are all about this. They were the first one to confirm the charter. The next one was the state of Ohio. Again, Cincinnati interests are pushing this. They are doing an effective job at working with the state legislature to get the approval. And they come through about a year and a month after Indiana. About the same time they were working on Ohio, they went to Illinois. And the Illinois state legislature, the first time in 1849, said no. Part of this was because in the 1830s, during what was called the era of good feeling, when a lot of these civic and state governments were investing in transportation infrastructure projects, the state of Illinois got burned pretty bad with several projects that just never got built despite getting state funds and the state going into debt to fund these projects. So the state legislature was not very enthusiastic. Interests in Chicago were not very enthusiastic. Interests in other parts of the states were not very enthusiastic because the railroad was not looking to end in Illinois. They wanted the end point to be St. Louis. And in fact, there's newspaper articles from the Springfield newspaper where they're saying, we don't want state money going to help St. Louis, Missouri. And it took a lot of lobbying to change that. And the O&M is going to bring in some pretty heavy hitters politically in Illinois to get the state legislature to change its mind. But it will get its charter on February 12th of 1851. Now, another interest that's fighting it, St. Louis is the 400-pound gorilla on the Mississippi River, or the 800-pound gorilla on the Mississippi River. Alton is one of the leaders of the resistance against St. Louis being the terminal point. They were trying to get Alton, Illinois, to be Illinois' version of St. Louis. And they tried very hard to block the O&M. They had proposed a competing railroad, and in fact, they do wind up building a competing railroad called the Chicago and Alton Railroad that connects Chicago and Alton, Illinois. They're going to be more friendly to interests coming from the New York area that are going to be running along the Great Lakes through Michigan to get to Chicago, and then take the Alton down to Alton, Illinois to get on the Mississippi River. And the idea being, if we boost Alton, we're going to keep the state money inside the state of Illinois, and it's going to benefit Illinois. Alton, there's a lot of these smaller river towns today that are fighting like mad to make sure they're not left behind. And in Illinois, they're pretty effective at trying to blunt the St. Louis interest. But eventually, that's overcome. Now, one of the things you have to do once you get your charter is you have to get the money. And this is a very light map. I'm sorry, it's very light. It's quite large. This is from the University of North Texas, and they have a great collection of maps online. And this is one of the earliest maps I could find. It's even earlier than the one that we have at the St. Louis Mercantile Library, and in fact, it's in a bit better shape than ours. This actual map was in the prospectus, essentially, for the O&M, the engineering report. And it's very delicate, and bless them for unfolding it and scanning it. I'm scared to do it to ours because it is very brittle. But this is the O&M as laid out by their chief engineer, a guy named Ormsby M. Mitchell. And the O&M line is this, if you can see my cursor. Cincinnati's here, St. Louis is here, that's the O&M. All these other railroads or projected railroads are coming in to the Midwest at this point. Not all of these are built, but these are surveyed lines at minimum. Some will not be built, some will be built, but they won't necessarily follow these routings. You can notice the Alton line is not showing up here the way it was built. So Mitchell is a good hire for this project, particularly in Ohio. He is the city astronomer for Cincinnati, Ohio. In fact, his observatory is still standing, and you can visit it to this day. He is a West Point graduate, so he is trained in engineering. He has retired to become a professional astronomer, but he really makes most of his money doing engineering survey type work. And he was very well connected within the city of Cincinnati and Ohio politics. So it was, a no-brainer to hire him to be the surveying engineer for this railroad. It plays very well to have a favorite son in a high position of authority. Now, so Mitchell did the surveying. The actual construction, again, belies where the money's really coming from. The gentleman on the right is Hezekiah Seymour. He is the chief engineer of the Erie Railroad. He is also the state surveyor and engineer for the state of New York. He sits on the Erie Canal Committee board, or the commission. This guy is wired into New York politics. And of all the potential contractors to build the railroad, they chose him. So any money that's being raised to build the railroad is going to go to H.C. Seymour and Company and then distributed to the contractors. And again, the Erie is promoting, and they're going to do this into the 1860s and 70s. This is an 1853 advertisement promoting connections to the West and Southwest. The Erie really, really, really wants to capture that, that traffic getting into St. Louis and to the Southwest. And they're trying like mad to get this thing built. Another indication that there's some New York investment, the big connection for the O&M gets started in 1851 in St. Louis as well, and it's the Pacific Railroad of Missouri. It's also built to Erie gauge. They're basically setting up to connect with the O&M. And their chief engineer is a guy named James Kirkwood, who is Scottish born, and he built the Storuca Viaduct on the Erie. And Kirkwood, again, New York influence on a Midwestern railroad project. Part of it also is the fact that there just aren't that many engineers to go around, but the fact that they chose Kirkwood, who had direct ties to the Erie, is very interesting. And I think, in my opinion, is a bit of a smoking gun for really what the objective was. This was a New York, I think, a New York idea for the Erie to really become the most competitive railroad in that state. So I have this slide up. This is various gauges. So you know what you're talking about. Erie gauge is not shown on this. This is actually from a British publication. Most railroads in the U.S. are being built at 4 foot 8.5 inches. And that is the most common. Erie is about 6 foot. So it's closest to Irish gauge. Why are you talking about gauges still? You would think that they would have made a decision, but railroad technology is still relatively new, and engineering is compromises. You know, engineering isn't building the structure, it's knowing what you don't need to build the structure safely. Pyramid is a great example. You can build a pyramid out of stone blocks and it's not going to fall down. Putting the hollow spaces in it without it collapsing, that takes some engineering. So they're making trade-offs. The narrower the railroad, the cheaper it is to build. You can build in more places. That's one reason why in very mountainous terrain, you see narrow gauge railroads. It's cheap. It's easier to get into these very narrow mountainous river corridors to go up into a mining area or a logging area. And when you're done, you can just walk away and you won't really have spent as much money as if you had built a standard gauge 4 foot 8.5 or a broad gauge railroad. Now, if you do build a broad gauge railroad, you can build bigger cars, which means you can carry more freight, which means you can more efficiently move goods and materials, and therefore get a better return on your investment per train. However, your construction costs are very high. The Erie has found that out. And the O&M is going to find that out because it gets really expensive to build a broad gauge railroad over time. And just to show you how non-standard it was, 4 foot 8.5, pretty standard in the mid-Atlantic into the upper Midwest. The South tends to be 5 foot gauge. It's not guaranteed 5 foot. You've got little pieces of 4 feet 10 inches between Meridian and Jackson and Vicksburg, which, well, that's going to get taken care of in the Civil War. Most of this actually is going to get taken care of in the Civil War. The gauges are either going to be taken over by the United States Army and re-gauged to 4 feet 8.5 inches, or they're going to be destroyed during the war and rebuilt at 4 feet 8.5 inches. Or in the 1870s, finally, when the rest of the country has basically said, we're going to do 4 feet 8.5 inches, and if you want to interchange with us, you're going to have to go to 4 feet 8.5 inches. Everybody else falls into line. Now, the nice thing is if you build wider than 4 feet 8.5 inches, you only have to move one rail in to your at standard gauge. That's not a problem. The real trick is when you're a narrow gauge railroad, you need to widen it. If anybody knows the Pittsburgh and Western line on the B&O, that was originally narrow gauge, and it was not cheap to widen it out because you had to take all the ties up because they're too short, and then you had to move the rail. So wide isn't necessarily a deal breaker long term if you wind up having to shift. Now, here are your big players in the Midwest for this project now. 1851, these three guys are the emissaries that wind up going to Illinois to the state legislature. Seymour doesn't show up very often, but Mitchell and John O'Fallon, who was a big political power in southern Illinois adjacent to St. Louis, and in fact in the St. Louis area proper. He had a lot of landed interests. He had a lot of commercial interests. He's a war veteran. He's known as Colonel O'Fallon. Today, there are two communities named after him, O'Fallon, Illinois, and O'Fallon, Missouri. That shows how large his reach is in the St. Louis area at the time. O'Fallon and Mitchell wind up spending a lot of time lobbying in Springfield, Illinois, to get the state legislature to change their mind. Seymour, in fact, will come to St. Louis in the 1850s, partially to do some follow-up on his construction contracts, but also to help make sure there's support. Now, of the three guys, Seymour gets the worst break out of this. He's in St. Louis, and there's a cholera outbreak. And he catches it. And it was a strain of cholera that either you could catch it in the morning and be dead in the afternoon, or you could linger. And unfortunately for Mr. Seymour, he caught it, and it was one of those that lingered. He made it to Cincinnati, which was the eastern terminus of the O&M, and died there. What's worse for Seymour, he was the driving force behind the prime contractor of the construction company. So when he went, the management of the construction of the railroad started to get wobbly, and that's going to lead to problems later on down the road. So here's, this is from the state of Illinois. This is what Illinois' town was like commercially in the 1850s, even as far back as the 1870s. A lot of this land now is fill or has been reclaimed from floodland by the development of the Army of the Mississippi River and the control that has been implemented by the Army Corps of Engineers for flooding. It doesn't necessarily work out all the time, but it is less susceptible to severe floods than it was. And this is the eastern or the western objective of the O&M. This is Illinois' town. This was what originally was East St. Louis. Up here, this is the Cone Yard area. And this is where the original freight house was for the O&M, B&O Southwestern, and B&O. But this is this objective. They want to get here. Wiggins Ferry controls this part of the shoreline in the 1830s. It is a flood area, so that is fungible over time. But Wiggins Ferry controls all movement across the river at this point. If you are going to move any kind of goods in any meaningful way, or if you're going to move a lot of people, you have to pay the Wiggins Ferry Company to go across the river or bring your own boat. But even then, there's no place to land it because Wiggins Ferry controls the levee here on this side of the river. And in Illinois, or in Missouri, they also have rights on the St. Louis side. Wiggins is able to effectively block the construction of the Eads Bridge in conjunction with interest from Chicago for about 25 years. because it's a threat to their monopoly on cross-river trade. And the O&M has to deal with them. That's one reason why they built their line basically right to the Wiggins Ferry complex here. They knew this is the end point. This is the people we have to work with. And there was no sense in trying to go around them. Alton tries to play that up as an alternative, but it just never really works out. So one condition that the state of Illinois puts on the railroad, they have to build 25 miles of track within a set time period, starting here at Illinois Town. They have to get to Lebanon, Illinois. And if they don't, their charter's null and void. Now, the nice thing is, it's pretty easy to build railroad track in this area until you get to the ancient eastern shoreline of the Mississippi River. If you've ever been to St. Louis and you've driven east from town, you cross the Mississippi and you see in the distance, it looks like a very slight ridge, almost like if you're driving on Interstate 70 west of Baltimore and you've cleared Frederick and you see the mountains. That ridge line in Illinois is the original eastern shoreline of the Mississippi River. It's the limestone cliffs. And that follows the original route. That's your first obstacle, but it's not that bad. They're not going to really get into problems with this railroad until they get into southern Indiana. So Cincinnati, they're the western point. You can see here, Cincinnati's got a lot of hills to it. Fortunately, they have this giant river that's right next to them, which a railroad always likes to see. Here's the O&M on this side of the city at their terminal, running along the shoreline of the Ohio River. This is from the Great Railway Celebrations of 1857 that William Prescott Smith had published with the B&O Railroad to promote basically the B&O supplanting the Erie interests as the patron of the O&M. We'll get to that later here. So they build concurrently Cincinnati West, St. Louis, Illinois Town rather, east. The Ohio and Indiana charters don't have the time limit, so the initial openings, the first one they do is at Illinois Town for the dedication ceremony. They have a second ceremony here in Cincinnati and start construction. It's no frills as they are building these stations. In fact, the O&M station for years will be criticized as being perhaps worse than a barn by Cincinnati citizens and travelers. It is heralded as a great way to get west, but the station is awful. And they try to fix it many, many times. This is another image from the Great Railway Celebrations of 1857. This is going west. You've gotten out of the Cincinnati metro area. You're following the O&M here. That is the Whitewater Canal. The railroad tried to take over the right-of-way of that canal, but they were unsuccessful in getting the interest to sell out, and they could not get eminent domain to take it over, which is very unfortunate because essentially this right-of-way is going to become the New York Central's right-of-way west of Cincinnati. But it would have been perfect because canals, it had already been built, it had already been graded, but despite the fact that it really hadn't been a big success like it had hoped to be, it still was able to fend off a competitive offer to take it over from the O&M. But you can see here, they're building right along the river, and the mountains on each side of this image show why they're building right in the middle of the river valley. They accept the risk of the floods, which will be a continual problem in this area, even after the Corps is able to institute flood control projects, basically to this day. It's a challenge, but it's a price they have to pay. Now, I was saying the big problem they hit is in southern Indiana. And again, if you were at the Seymour Convention, we were kind of right in the middle of that. This is the Indiana Geological Survey of the Stone Belt. And here's Seymour. This was where our convention was based out of. And here's Bedford. We stopped at Bedford. We stopped at Mitchell. This is US 50. Generally, US 50 will parallel the Ohio and Mississippi for most of its trip. As you can see here, there's a disconnect between Bedford and Mitchell. The O&M originally likes to build along river lines. The US Unified Highway System doesn't really matter as much. They'll take straight lines and they get away with it. But Bedford, this area causes two of the most expensive parts of the railroad to be built. It's the only two tunnels on the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad. Really, I think they reached out to their marketing department and really, I mean, they dug deep for these names. The first tunnel was a fairly short tunnel, and the name was Little Tunnel. And the second tunnel was a longer tunnel, and they called it Big Tunnel. And just kudos to the marketing department for those names. Little Tunnel is going to wind up being daylighted, and it's now called Little Tunnel Cut on the timetable maps or timetables. Big Tunnel still exists. It's not an active railroad for the most part. It's still CSX property though, so we highly recommend not trespassing. That has not stopped the locals from enjoying the spray paint. But you can also see how rusty these rails are. This isn't seeing a lot of traffic, but it's still there. It's still CSX. And this is the brick lining that was built around the 20th century when a lot of these tunnels got lined. Originally, I believe this was just a rock tunnel. But this was a big slowdown for completing the railroad. Now, this is the finished routing. This is from a timetable map in the 1870s. And there's a couple things that have been added on here. Shortly after they started building, they realized getting a connection in the Louisville area would not hurt their traffic. And the O&M, pretty much like every other railroad in the 19th century, was chronically undercapitalized. And it got to a point where if they were going to keep going, they needed to find a way to bring in revenue. And Louisville was one of the first places they could get to that would be a potentially great revenue source. So they built a branch from North Vernon to Louisville. And ironically, this is probably the most successful branch line of the entire O&M railroad. This actually is probably the most successful part of the O&M because it's still in use. This is connecting CSX from North Vernon to Louisville. Still sees plenty of traffic. In fact, you remember when we went to North Vernon, the trains we saw were going on to the Louisville branch. And they cross on the K&IT bridge and go into the Louisville terminal area. That's the Kentucky and Indiana terminal. B&O was a part owner of that company. You have another branch line that gets built, Beardstown to Shawneetown. Dwayne Carroll and some other folks have done some really good writing on that. There's marvelous Sentinel articles that cover that. Dwayne's was, I think, the first one that came out, followed up by some others as people were able to bring in their recollections. This piece of railroad is gone. It is a wide spot. You can see it on Google Earth. But at one time, they were moving quite a bit of agricultural commodities on this. And it set up some really interesting operations in Flora here in Illinois. But this was the O&M. This was really the O&M at its peak as an independent company. This Louisville line gave them much needed revenue to keep going. And the line between Cincinnati and St. Louis, it had a lot of debt, and it was going, but it was struggling. Partially because they had underestimated construction costs by a factor of 3. Mitchell had suggested $5 million to build the railroad, and wound up costing 15. And further, when Seymour dies, his construction company folds. And that causes the subcontractors not to get paid, which causes them to say, I'm going to stop working because I don't work for free. And even worse, one of the big banks in St. Louis, Henry Bacon and Company, they fold because of this. They have a run on the bank, and the St. Louis office folds, and it almost causes the bank to fail in San Francisco. But fortunately, they have a steady stream of gold coming in from the gold rush that they are able to recover their capitalization. But for a period of time, the Bacon Bank was looking very, very tenuous, which could have brought down a lot of financial problems on this railroad and in the region in general. O&M Power, predominantly 440s. This is the Stanton. There's not a lot of imagery done of O&M railroads, motive power, while they were an independent company. There's a lot more photographs of B&O Southwestern Power, B&O Southwestern Rolling Stock. Part of this is, by the time the railroad got going, you had some financial panics going on. It was, they had a lot of other things to worry about than hiring photographers to start promoting the railroad. They were trying to get traffic other ways. And photography was, you know, you're in the Midwest. You don't have the number of photographers that you had on the East Coast. So it's very rare to find good photographs of O&M equipment. Engineering-wise, this is the Embarrass River Bridge in Illinois. There's still a bridge at this point. This was the original bridge. It's predominantly wood construction, stone piers. You know, if you've read some of the books like Diltz's Great Road, you know, the original idea on railroads was we were going to build these marvelous stone bridges and viaducts that were going to last forever. And then they started just losing their shirts on the construction costs. So wood starts getting real popular, wood and iron. And you can see here, this is iron truss bracing. This is a relatively new technology, but it's effective and it's cheaper than stone. This bridge, of course, is not going to last too long because technology is going to surpass it in terms of locomotive weight. And then you'll have better metallurgy to build steel bridges. And in fact, today, I think the bridge is a steel girder bridge across that river in Illinois. And I also believe the grade's been raised because of flooding issues. This is from the B&O's article, the Society's article on Washington, Indiana. And this is a Bob Clark collection photo. This was the O&M's depot. You can see it's not real exciting. The architecture is plain. This is a railroad that's not spending a huge amount of money on structures because they don't have a huge amount of money to spend. There's not a lot of ornamentation. This is also 100 years after the fact, but I mean, it's not brick, it's not stone, it's wood. You can kind of tell how a railroad wants to spend its money by what construction materials it uses on its structures. And if you got a lot of money, you see a lot of brick and stone stations. Wood, it's either hard to get or it's too expensive for a stone or a brick station. Here's a great map, and I'm sorry it's small. This will be online at the St. Louis Mercantile Library. This is from one of our mapping exhibitions, but is a great map of Wiggins Ferry terminal area. And so this is St. Louis here at the bottom. All of this land is controlled by Wiggins Ferry. You cannot get freight onto the water from this piece of property without paying the Wiggins Ferry Company to do it. So you'll also notice there are these black boxes. Those are the freight warehouses. all the lines from the east are coming in perpendicular to the flow of the river. They go into the warehouses, and either they'll be unloaded break bulk freight there, or they'll go to one of these ferry piers and cross the river that way. This track is essentially the Wiggins Ferry track. This is going to become part of the terminal railroad eventually. And in fact, pretty much all of this is going to become terminal railroad trackage in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And this is what the B&O's freight house looked like. This was originally a B&O Southwestern structure. The original O&M freight house, I have not yet found any images of it. I would love to find some. And I'm in St. Louis, and I can't find pictures of it, so that tells you how hard it is to find pictures of it. But this is what it looked like. And again, perpendicular to the river. There's a lot of cartage equipment here, trailers to move things around between other freight houses. But you know, the original orientation is hand off to the Wiggins folks, and they'll take it across the river. This is an aerial shot that shows what the area looks like. The B&O's freight house is here. This is the Eads Bridge. And up this way is Cone Yard. There's a better map of it. Okay, I'm getting to 50 minutes, so I'm going to start speeding up here. This is St. Louis in 1850s. This is the objective, and you can see how prosperous the city is. You'd be hard-pressed to remember that by the time the railroad was finished in 1857, 8 years before, most of this riverfront had burned to the ground in a fire. 1849 was a really bad year for St. Louis. First off, we had no baseball, so there were no Cardinals to lift our spirits. We didn't have a good hockey team, and there was a big cholera epidemic and the big fire. So 1849, a year for St. Louis to kind of say we're going to take the mulligan on. But 1857, it's making money, and all these boats, that's cash right there. The O&M, while it's making some money from its freight, it's still not making enough to service all the debt. They're trying to sell off their lands that they can develop. Any extra property that the railroad had acquired to build right-of-way on that they didn't need, or property that they had acquired that was potential development, they're trying to sell it. They're trying to get people to buy it. They're trying to get people to put farms on and produce products that the railroad can haul and make more money. They're also working hard to get that traffic from the East Coast. Now that they're done, in 1854, the railroad is pretty much finished. They can at least connect with the eastern lines, and they are making a big play for traffic from the East Coast. This is actually from the Boston General Agent. This poster was made for the O&M to be posted with their freight and passenger agents. This is from Boston. That's how far they're trying to draw traffic from. This is actually from the Bureau of Railway Economics collection. This is in the library. Cool story. We found it just by accident one day. It was folded up in an envelope. It got scanned within 30 minutes. So really cool. And this is 1855. So they're looking to get people from New England into the West. If you play up also what's going on in Kansas and Nebraska at this time, there's motivated people going from the abolitionist New England area into the territories to try and stop the spread of slavery. And the O&M doesn't really care who's spending the money so long as you're buying the ticket. Now in 1857, the B&O really kind of is in a decent spot financially. They're not great because there's a panic going on financially, but they got enough money that Chauncey Brooks, who's the president in the center here, and William Prescott Smith, who's essentially the guy in charge of railroad operations, he's the master of the road, he is able to get this big railway celebration to celebrate that you can take the B&O Railroad and take a train from Baltimore to St. Louis, Missouri. Never mind the fact that you have to change trains 3 times to do it. You can do it. and they do this great public relations trip. And that's when you start seeing the O&M brought out of the Erie's orbit and into the B&O's orbit. Part of that is the weakness of the Erie. They're now having to fight the Vanderbilts in New York. They don't have time to really focus on the Western expansion. And the B&O is looking at this other railroad that I call Brand X that runs between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh that's also looking to expand in the Midwest. And they're thinking, we've got to find a way to connect the East Coast and the Midwest. Oh, hey, the O&M's here. Let's figure out a way. And it's kind of Frankenstein's monster, but it works. They have the Little Miami Railroad that they work with, the Northwest Virginia Railroad, which they had essentially taken control of, that runs from Grafton to Parkersburg. You're at the Parkersburg Convention, you know about that. The O&M tries to improve its fortunes by hiring in good management. This guy is George McClellan. If you're a Civil War buff, you know who this guy is. He was a really high up guy in the Illinois Central. He was a high vice president, essentially the guy in charge of running the railroad. And if nothing else, when he walked into a room, at least one person thought he was the smartest man in the room. Usually that was George McClellan, but he was not a dumb guy. He was a West Point trained engineer, very, very effective railroad executive for the IC. And the O&M hires him to run the Eastern Division of the railroad in 1860. And they're hoping he can turn the fortunes around of the O&M because of his experience with the IC. Fortunately, in April of 1861, he gets a better job offer from first from the state of Ohio, and then the United States government. So we lose him with barely a year on the job. Despite that, they're still running trains. They do quite well during the Civil War. They do have one notable accident early on, but you can see they're moving 3 express trains a day. And also, as a footnote, during the Civil War, actually right after the Civil War, they are the site of one of the first train robberies, the Reno Gang. Frank and John Reno, Southern Illinois guys, kind of rabble-rousers in the Seymour area. They decide they're going to rob the Adams Express safe on an O&M train. And their story, they get eclipsed by the James Gang, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in current times. But in the 50s, they were still a pretty hot story, enough that when they needed a vehicle for Elvis Presley in 1957, Love Me Tender is based on the Reno Gangs. And Elvis plays the youngest Reno brother who's trying to stay on the straight and narrow path. If you want to have if you're an Elvis fan and you want to see a mediocre movie, this is one of his most mediocre, but it's there, and he made it to the big screen. And they do have the train robbery in it. O&M starts to improve their Cincinnati depot in the 1870s. They're trying to compete now. Competition's going up. They're still kind of behind the financial 8 ball, but more and more B&O money is coming in, so they're able to rebuild the depot in Cincinnati. 1875, the Eads Bridge is built, and that now means they don't have to deal with the Wiggins Company. They can go across on a bridge. That's going to vastly improve service across the river. However, it does mean the railroad has to do a big change. They had to change their gauge to 4 feet 8.5 inches because that was going to be the track on the Eads Bridge. The Pacific Railroad was changing its gauge. Everybody else changed its gauge. The O&M did it within a day. It was pretty amazing that they're able to do that. But again, narrowing the gauge is a lot easier than lengthening the gauge. And the Eads Bridge becomes a very prominent piece of imagery in their marketing. This is the new station at Flora. As B&O development comes in, things get rebuilt. This is not the original station. This is the second station. Flora is where the Springfield, the Shawneetown to Beardstown line crosses the main line of the O&M. This shot actually is from a funeral home in Flora. And it's really cool because these 3 trains were all scheduled to be in this spot at the same time to make connections. And I think it's really neat that they did that and that they were able to get it to work. Now, in the 1880s, 1870s, the B&O influence really comes about and starts taking over. Garrett had been gradually increasing influence on the O&M, buying up debt, buying up stock in the 1860s, 1870s. Eventually it gets to a point where the B&O has control of the O&M, the Marietta and Cincinnati, and other railroads, and they create the B&O Southwestern. So you start to see connections advertised to Baltimore and Washington on the O&M. That's the beginning of B&O influence. New York and Boston aren't showing up on the timetables anymore. The broad gauge, that stops being an advertising gimmick. They do start promoting post-Civil War traffic into Texas. That's another growth area for railroads. And then they switch to the B&O Southwestern. It's operated as a separate company from the B&O. It stays like this until 1918. And then at that point, it gets merged out of existence from an accounting standpoint, and it's all the B&O. But that'll be a presentation for another day because I have gone way over, and we'll go ahead and open things up for questions.
Yeah, I don't see any questions unless I've missed something. One of the questions I have though is what was the bridge made out of, Nick, that you discussed earlier?
The Embarra River Bridge was
Yeah.
was a iron truss bridge with some wood decking and stone piers. So, you know, it's better than wood, but not as expensive as stone.
So yeah, iron truss. Okay.
Yeah, if you look at it, it's very close to a Bowman truss.
And so they used wood decking on it. That's interesting too.
Yeah.
I guess. And I guess my next question is that I would have is what the Erie were instrumental in building it, and then how quickly did they lose influence on it?
Basically, about the time of the Civil War is when they start. You know, Jay Gould starts coming in 1869. And at that point, the attention becomes focused on fighting Vanderbilt and the New York Central. And the Erie War is ruinously expensive. And so capital that they would have used to assert and shore up their control over the O&M and later the Pacific Railroad, it's not there. They're fighting Vanderbilt with it. And that really puts them behind the 8-ball in terms of the Eastern railroads. They spent so much time fighting the richest guy in the world that they didn't have any more money. And okay. You know that, and the shenanigans with there are books about the shenanigans with the Erie in the 1860s, and they are fascinating to read. And it's really neat to see they had this vision that if they had not lost control of the company to Gould and then decided to pick a fight with Vanderbilt, they could have been in a much better spot than they wound up becoming.
Ah, okay. Thank you. And I don't, let me check the chat. You can look at the chat too, but I don't see any, I don't think I see any questions.
I see a couple here.
Okay.
Jeffrey Hallowell had a question about the Pacific Railroad of Missouri. Did that become a portion of the MOPAC? Yes, that became the Missouri Pacific. In fact, the city of Kirkwood is named after James P. Kirkwood, which is where I live, and that is on the original route of the Pacific Railroad of Missouri. And they don't get to Kansas City until 1865. And they're also in such bad financial shape that they're picked over. The Goulds wind up taking control for a period of time. The Van Sweringen brothers take control for a period of time. It's really not until the 20th century that the MOPAC kind of is able to stand on its own. Why did the B&O, this is from TWB 31, why did the B&O wait to 1918 to merge the B&O Southwestern into the B&O? A lot of that had to deal with they could hide profits in these smaller companies. And if you look at the corporate history of the B&O, I think it's online through the Internet Archive, but there's a 4-volume valuation history of the B&O. And there are so many little companies that if you're a trained accountant, I would not be surprised if you just started shuttering. And it was a way they could hide profits. You had tax advantages with certain charters. One reason why the B&O existed as long as it did in its history, it never had to pay property tax in Maryland. And when CSX eliminated the company in 1987, it did so knowing that it was going to have to pay property taxes. And with the B&O Southwestern, one reason it was eliminated is from the United States Railroad Administration was in control in 1918, and they were like, no, this is stupid. You're making this way more complicated than they needed to be done. And the B&O kind of had to accept it. And that happened with a lot of railroads that were under USRA control. A lot of these, what I call stupid accounting tricks, were eliminated. No one has written a full history of the USRA. I wish they would, because the thing that it did to change the companies, the industry in general, is amazing. Let's see. I don't
see any other questions.
Okay.
Anyway, great presentation. That was very detailed. A lot of information that most of us probably didn't know.
Thank you. Thank you. This was fun. I mean, Ed did a lot of research and got a lot of this started. But the 19th century stuff, you can really lose yourself in it. So that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and the Reno gang was very notorious in that area where they lived. There's a lady who wrote a book on it.
I actually have it. I bought it for the research on the division. So, and it's pretty good.
I mean, they were regular. I mean, they were thugs. I mean, they would salesmen would come into towns. At one of the towns, I forget which one down there, and basically they would come in one day and leave in a body bag the next day.
Yeah.
A victim of the Reno gang, and their other people who participated.
Oh.
So anyway, I'm going to move on to Mike Lytle.
Doug Swesty has a quick question.
Okay.
This line was mainly moving freight. It was involved in the 1863 movement of the what became the 20th Corps, the 11th and 12th Corps of the Army of the Potomac. It was partially involved in that move between Cincinnati and Louisville. But for the most part, while it was like targeted by some Confederate raiders, it was spared most of the war, and it made generally made money moving freight and soldiers. And I think that's the last question.
Okay. Well, I'll move on to Mike Lytle and his presentation on